This is lecture MS-4, the last of the muscular system lectures. In this lecture, we're going to mostly be talking about smooth muscle. We'll start by talking about some of the characteristics of smooth muscle, the difference between single and multi-unit smooth muscle and how those are found in the body. We'll talk about how smooth muscle is controlled with examples of local messengers, autonomic nervous system, and intrinsic control. And then we'll talk about how smooth muscle works, how the myofilaments are different in smooth muscle, how they're attached to the cell surface with dense bodies, and how smooth muscle myosin is different and how that is involved in controlling smooth muscle. We've spent the last few lectures talking about skeletal muscle, and you've learned pretty much everything you need to know about skeletal muscle. But we mentioned that there were two other kinds of muscle in the body. Cardiac muscle, found in the heart. We're going to talk about that in the cardiovascular system, which is coming up next. And smooth muscle, which when we talked about smooth muscle, we talked about how it has some different characteristics from both skeletal and cardiac. So, smooth muscle, if you remember, is mostly found around tubes and hollow organs. Mostly. So things like the blood vessels or the digestive tract or air passages or urinary tract or reproductive tract, all of those areas where you've got a tube, very often you'll have smooth muscle around that tube. And that smooth muscle is mostly about controlling the flow of things within that tube. So in blood vessels, it's about controlling the pressure and the flow of blood. In the digestive system, it's about controlling the flow of partially digested food, moving it from place to place, churning it around, mixing it with things. In a few other places, like in the eyes, you could think of it as being about controlling the flow of light, although light doesn't flow exactly, but still kind of the same idea, that we're applying a control to how much light gets through an area at a given time. Or also in the eye, controlling the how tightly stretched the lens is, which is different, but still. So it's mostly about controlling flow. Now, some other things about smooth muscle. Its twitches are much slower than skeletal muscle. Remember, skeletal muscle is on the scale of 10 to 100 milliseconds for a twitch. Cardiac muscle, as we'll talk about, is more like 200-ish milliseconds. Smooth muscle is often around 4,000 milliseconds or more for a twitch. So that's 4 seconds. So whereas skeletal muscle is smooth muscle is like that for a single muscle twitch. It's also, and this is a unique thing for smooth muscle, it can sustain a contraction without using extra energy. So if I want to sustain a contraction in skeletal muscle, I have to keep twitching it so that those twitches either overlap with each other in a whole muscle, or summate on top of each other for a single fiber. But either way, I have to keep spending energy to keep that muscle twitching to sustain a contraction. Smooth muscle, through a mechanism that we don't really understand yet, can do something called latching, where if this is a ring of smooth muscle, it can contract and then latch in that contracted state so it doesn't relax from there. But it doesn't have to keep spending energy to stay in that contracted state. We don't yet fully understand that, but we know it can do it, and it's useful for things like, say, in a blood vessel. You can apply a certain amount of pressure to the blood in that vessel and then keep that as your base level of pressure without having to spend a lot of energy to continuously apply it. You can just make sure that vessel is normally this constricted. That's its normal state. That's one thing you can do with latching in smooth muscle. So that kind of covers the general characteristics. Also, we can talk about how it's controlled. So smooth muscle can be controlled by lots and lots of things. It can be controlled by the autonomic nervous system, the local environment and local messengers, like paracrine messengers, hormones, so longer distance chemical signaling, And a lot of smooth muscle has intrinsic control, meaning it can control its own contractions. It has specialized cells that give the signal to contract from within the muscle itself. You see that a lot in the digestive tract. We'll talk about that a little bit today and more in the digestive tract when we get there toward the end of the class. So let's talk for a moment about what smooth muscle generally looks like. So unlike skeletal muscle, which is large parallel fibers, smooth muscle is small, skinny cells, sometimes called spindle-shaped, meaning long and thin, arranged in layers. Generally, these cells are mononucleated, so one nucleus per cell. And those layers can either be in a flat surface or, fairly often, when they're around a tube, they're arranged kind of like this. This is making those cells much, much bigger than they would be in a tube of that size. But you get the idea. Now, there's one major difference between different groups of smooth muscle, and that's the idea of single unit versus multi-unit muscle. In single unit muscle, we'll draw our cells here. So if I have a group of smooth muscle cells arranged in layers in single unit muscle, they're all going to be connected by gap junctions. So if you remember, gap junctions are those little channels that pair up between cells to form little tunnels from one cell to the next. So in single unit muscle, all of these cells are connected to each other so that if I have some sort of signal to contract in one cell, it will pass to all the other cells down these gap junctions. So that if one cell gets the signal to contract, it spreads to all of the other cells that are connected in that single unit so that they all work more or less together. That one common way you would find that would be, for example, in a ring of smooth muscle around the digestive tract. If all of the cells in that ring are all connected together, then when any of them gets a signal to contract, it spreads through the whole ring, and the whole ring contracts together and relaxes together. Meaning that whole mess of connected muscle works as a single unit, hence the name. So in single unit muscle, the cells are connected by gap junctions, which means they can all respond together as a single unit. Now compare that to multi-unit smooth muscle, where you can have a similar arrangement of cells, but there are no gap junctions, which means each cell responds individually. That is relatively rare in the body. Most of your smooth muscle is single unit. Multi-unit smooth muscle is mostly found in the eyes. So the smooth muscles that in your iris that control the diameter of your pupil, and the smooth muscles that control the tension on the lens in the eye. So pupillary and lens muscles, and in the reproductive tract. The main advantage of multi-unit muscle is that it makes it easier to have differing strengths of contraction. In single unit muscle, when you tell that muscle to contract, that group of single unit will, to some degree, either contract or not contract, but the whole thing works together. There's no way to get any one part of it to contract. You can, to some degree, control how much it contracts, but the whole thing's going to work. Whereas in multi-unit muscle, it's easier to get some parts of the muscle to contract, but not others, which can be useful in getting different levels of strength out of that muscle. Which makes sense in the eyes, that if you want to control your lens, you need to be able to make the lens focus in very small amounts. Same with the pupil. You need to be able to dilate or constrict it in small gradients. That would be harder if it were single unit muscle. So it makes some sense to have it that way. Now, as one example of how this works, there is actually one organ in the body that starts out as multi-unit muscle, but at certain times becomes single unit muscle, and then will then transfer back into multi-unit later. That's the uterus. So the uterus begins as multi-unit muscle. So normally the cells of the uterus are not connected by gap junctions, but when a person with a uterus is pregnant, late in that pregnancy, those smooth muscle cells in the uterus start to make gap junctions and start to link up with each other, turning the uterus gradually into single unit muscle, all connected in one piece. I have never been pregnant, obviously, but my understanding is that it is common during pregnancy to undergo something called Braxton Hicks contractions, where later in the pregnancy, parts of the uterus will have little mini labor contractions. One part of the uterus will do a contraction and then a release, and then maybe another part will do that. And over time, which areas are involved in that can get bigger and bigger until eventually the whole uterus is doing it, and that can actually lead straight into labor. That makes a lot of sense if you imagine those smooth muscle cells putting out gap junctions. So more and more of them get connected, so larger areas are all responding together until the entire uterus is one massive single unit muscle. Now we want it to be that because in order for a child to be born, the uterus has to contract hard enough to push the baby's head against the cervix and stretch that cervix out around the head. That's difficult. So you need the unified strength of a whole uterus, all of that muscle working together as one unit to contract hard enough to do that job of stretching the cervix around the baby's head. Then after pregnancy, the uterus will gradually turn back into multi-unit muscle. Although, I don't know if the next time it's easier for it to become single unit, because of course labor works often differently in subsequent labors. That might be part of it. I don't know. But anyway, that's an example of the idea of multi-unit and single unit muscle. So the uterus becomes single unit later in pregnancy. Alrighty. Now, what we're going to do next is talk about some examples of these different kinds of control. How autonomic nervous system control works, and then how an example of how the local environment might control smooth muscle, and then some examples of hormones and intrinsic control. So that'll be in the second part of this lecture.